edition of Governed by God, a biblical look at law, civics, and civil government. My name is Eric Leupold. Thank you for joining me on today's episode. So, in keeping with the theme of the American founding, today I had the opportunity to interview Pastor David Reece, who is pastor of Puritan Reformed Church in Phoenix, Arizona, and also as the CEO and founder of Reece Fund. But I've heard Pastor Reece speak at several different conferences, and I've also listened to him on a variety of podcasts. And I'm just very glad to have the opportunity to talk to him about covenants, about the importance of civic covenanting and the history behind it, and particularly the history of covenanting in the United States. And so we talk about that and talk about a lot of other things related to the civil magistrates and how we as Christians are to go about responding to an ever increasingly secular United States. And so without further ado, Pastor David Reece. All right, well, Pastor Reece, thank you for joining me on the podcast today. And I already mentioned this to you before we started the show, but my theme for this season of Governed by God is to look at, well, the founding and the history, the origins of the American nation, the United States, given that it's our upcoming 250th anniversary since the Declaration of Independence. So I've already looked at in previous episodes very briefly how the Reformation impacted the relationship between church and state. Then I zoomed in on the Reformation in England and how there was a struggle with it not going. The Puritans believed it didn't go far enough, and they were wrestling through how to relate to the king, who is the head of the church, but also the idea of having, congregational churches or independent churches, or is it all going to be Presbyterian? And then what do you do when you have the Scottish Parliament disagreeing with the English Parliament, but they're all under one monarch? And then most recently, I looked at some of the events leading up to the American War for Independence, the colonies identifying themselves as kind of like a quasi their own parliaments, where they're co-equal in a way with English Parliament or Scottish Parliament. They make their own taxes, they make their own laws, but they have, of course, one common monarch, and that the whole idea of being taxed by English Parliament would be very similar to me living in Pennsylvania getting a tax bill from California, which they have no business taxing me. So given all that context, and I briefly touched on things like the Covenanters and what they did in Scotland and England, but I really wanted to settle in on the topic of covenant, and it's very timely because I just finished looking at up to the War of Independence, and I want to look at now the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, Articles of Confederation, and I think it's as good a time as any to talk about the concept of covenant. And so that's why I wanted to bring you on the show, because you've spoken much about this. I've listened to you talk about the concept of covenant, the importance of it, and I think a lot of my listeners and fellow Christians, perhaps they've lost a bit of understanding and appreciating the importance of civil covenants. So that's kind of like my first question I want to give to you is, can you explain like the difference or the highlights between a covenant and a contract? What makes a covenant, and how do we understand that concept?
Absolutely, yeah. So thank you, Mr. Leupold. I appreciate the opportunity to explain all this, and thanks for having me on. I think as regards a covenant, the simplest way I could define a covenant is simply to swear certain duties. When you swear, you're calling upon the witness of God. So you're calling God to witness the promise that you make, the assertion that you make, and you're asking him to bless the truth telling and to curse the lying, right? So if it's just an assertion, like in bearing testimony as a witness, then it's, hey, God bless me if I'm telling the truth, God curse me if I'm telling a lie. And when it's a promise about future action, it's calling on God to bless the keeping and to curse the breaking. Now, there are kind of formulas that people have put together to try to express this in terms of the way that covenants are when God imposes them. And so one of the famous ones is O. Palmer Robertson's from Christ of the Covenants, where he has that a covenant is defined as a bond in blood sovereignly administered. And so the idea of a bond in blood is actually the most basic essence of a covenant. A bond is when you swear, this idea of like forming an obligation or connection through swearing. And then in blood means it's got life or death consequences, which is inherent in every time you swear because there's this idea of spiritual life or death and the idea of God potentially bringing curse that might kill you, right? So this idea of the in blood, blood is a symbol for life, and then he talks about the idea of it's sovereignly administered. So when God imposes a covenant between God and man, he, as the sovereign, defines how it's administered. He defines sort of the external actions that are used in terms of governing the relationship between God and man. So you can think about this in terms of sort of the historical covenants that God has imposed. First, with Adam before the fall, there was the covenant of works, and he gave sort of dominion and marriage and Sabbath as these, these creation ordinances that defined the administration. But he also gave um, two symbols of the covenant: the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so, the tree of life being a symbol for all of the benefits of spiritual life, and also kind of physical healing or maintenance properties. And then you also find this idea of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil being a symbol for, are you going to accept the definition of good and evil by God's law, theonomy, or are you going to have an autonomous definition of good and evil, pretending to be God, right? By eating this tree, you're kind of declaring yourself God, which is an ineffectual declaration and it has very negative outcomes. So besides that, you then have the other administrations which are actually a distinct covenantal order, where there's the covenant of grace, where God promises the gospel in Genesis 3:15, the promise of the seed of the woman. You have this you have also the institution of clothing, which is a ceremony that is a sexual ceremony relating to modesty and the covering of nakedness, and it's a symbol for the imputed righteousness of Christ. You have also animal sacrifice instituted because God stopped creating at that point, and so when He took the animal skins, it was off of an animal. I don't know about you, but when I take the skins off of animals, they tend to die. So that sort of killing of the animal, and then there's sort of there's the Noahic with now you can eat meat, and then there's the civil government. There's the Abrahamic where circumcision's added. There's the Mosaic where you have a bunch of stuff added, all sorts of external ceremonies. You have the Davidic where the tabernacle is replaced with a temple, and sort of there's an increase of the musical instruments that are added. And then you have the new covenant with Christ, and so this idea that's the same gospel throughout, but a change of the outward administration. So that's the sovereignly administered part. And so the covenant of works, covenant of grace being the two big structures, the covenant of grace having a bunch of those kind of stepping stones of things where ceremonies are given to prepare things for Christ, to increase the number of kind of pictures that exist to help to be a visible word to remind us of things that Christ is doing. But anyways, so you think about that. There's this famous thing, I think it came from Ray Sutton, where he talks about theos being a way of describing the structures as God's sovereign administration works in these covenants. And this is something that helps you as you look at those kind of seven covenantal steps that we looked at, that there's the idea that in each one it's given by a transcendent authority, right? So the theos is an acronym, and the first one, the transcendent authority, and the answer for that one is always the transcendent authority is God. The answer is always God. And so then he gives a hierarchical delegation of authority to man, and so he grants different authorities in each one. Um, and then there's an ethic where there's commandments from God about how you're supposed to interact with God and man. There's It's established by oath, so there's blessing and cursing, just like we talked about before, and then it has a process of succession, so that there's sort of for example, you and I are guilty in Adam, right? There's a reception of all of the curses through Adam, and then you think about line of succession that occurs in each of the covenants as a process of succession for those who are the descendants or those who join covenantally. And so, like for example, in a household, there are blessings and curses across generations. And we think about this idea of the third and fourth generation and bringing curse, and then the idea of 1,000 generations bringing blessing. That's kind of an example of that succession policy. And so those are those are some of the key things about a covenant. And a lot of people don't understand the succession element, and that's why in a civil covenant, if you're born into a nation, you would receive a civil order that was established by your parents as something that's obligatory upon you. And so that's sort of an effort to say, here's covenanting in general. Here's how it kind of connects into the idea of something that would be related to authority and how it goes across generations.
Hmm, very nice. Yeah. And what makes that really set apart from a contract?
So a contract is merely you might have representations, which could be an assertion of what's
Uh-huh.
true, um, and you also could make promises of fulfillment, right? So contracts require that there be things that are being relied upon that have some sort of a value or whatever. But the point is, there's an exchange of promises or representations that are meant to provide value, and that and a contract doesn't necessarily call upon the witness of God. It's not necessarily sworn, right? So the swearing, the calling upon the test, the witness of God, and therefore the blessing and cursing is the thing. So there's always blessing and cursing for telling the truth or for lying,
Yeah.
but the swearing is a magnifier of it, right? It multiplies it. It's calling on God to increase the blessing or to increase the cursing, and it therefore makes it more serious and draws more attention to it. And so it should only be used in matters of weight and moment.
Hmm. Would it be fair to say that like a contract tends to be very temporary, but a covenant is much more long lasting, even many times beyond the initial generation, but a contract might not be?
Yeah, that's a great point. A contract, in order to inherit a contract, you have to accept the reception of an estate.
Mhm.
In order to receive a covenant, you are stuck with it, right? It's a if you're, right, if you're born, under a covenantal authority, you stuck with that obligation. And furthermore, if you covenant into it, even if you weren't born into it, you if you covenant in, then you also receive that kind of covenant succession. So if you're born into the United States, you're born under the blessings and curses of the kind of covenantal history. And if you join in, you then become a recipient of the blessings or curses of that covenantal history.
Okay, yeah, that's very helpful. And what's interesting is that, growing up, and I grew up in the public school system. So growing up, I didn't really like I was taught very basically about, social contract theory. That's kind of how we all get together as a nation, but not really about covenants, not really about covenanting or the differences. And so I think that this concept of social contract theory has been kind of not forced upon us, but we've been fed this as a society. So what is well, first of all, what is the social contract theory, and how does that contrast with the biblical concept of covenant?
Yeah, so social contract theory is an effort to make it so that the individual's will to voluntarily enter into some arrangement is the basis of civil government, which doesn't work. In order to try to make it work, you end up kind of turning it into a sort of covenant a lot of the time. But people kind of want to have this like adhesion contract view of it, where it's like, you've accepted the terms and conditions by being here or being born here, and it's like that's not really how contracts work. You can have maybe if you have an informed consent where you're coming into a place, that kind of thing. But trying to make it so that there's some effort to make all the principles of contract apply on a basic level. Every theory for the justification of government is an effort to try to explain why civil government is morally acceptable. Because it's dealing with this question of like, hey, why can one man order another man around? And if he doesn't obey him, use coercive power, even to the point of death, in response to his non obedience? That is an interesting question. Can I be that guy? Can we just I'm good. If you would agree, I would agree. I'll be the guy who can tell you what to do. And then if you don't do it, I could kill you, right? Is
It's
this
a win-win.
deal? Deal? Shake my hand. Like so
It's a
that
win-win.
right. So that question of like who gets to tell whom what to do and what power can they use to make them do it, right? That's like the basic issue. So you look at this question, and a lot of people, if you just look at that, you kind of the starting point sort of becomes anarchy, right? You're like, well, maybe there's not. Maybe there's no justification for civil
Mm,
power. Maybe people don't just get to walk around telling other people what to do and threaten them with death if they don't obey them.
mm,
And so then it's like, okay, so anarchy is this big question, and people don't take anarchy seriously enough. People kind of just blow it off, and
mm,
I think that's in part in America because we are so pragmatic, right? We're very focused on like what works, and we're like, anarchy, that would be stupid. It wouldn't work, and that's true. That's exactly right. It wouldn't work.
it's true.
But at the same time, it's sort of like, well, okay, but I mean, is that how we determine what's true and what's right? It's just that it doesn't work, right? So the question of ethics on this, civil government, questions of civil power, or political theory, political philosophy, is a subset of the question of ethics, right? So, like, how do you know what's good controls how do you know what's good for civil power or for the state?
Mm,
And so we have to have a systematic answer there. So the Christian who's committed to sola scriptura, if you're committed to the sufficiency of scripture for doctrine and life, you're going to say, okay, well, my ethics come from the Bible. My political philosophy is a subset of ethics. Therefore, my political philosophy needs to come from the Bible. And
mm,
so you're going to have this principle of divine law and the system of covenants and covenantal institutions where God establishes them, right? So you're going to go like, hey, the individual is given his authority over the creation back in the dominion mandate in Genesis in chapters 1 and 2. Marriage is established and the household with household authority is established in Genesis 1 and 2, right? And you find like, that poem where Adam talks about, out of man she was taken and all that, right? So you have this sort
mhm,
of this whole thing. Okay, well, where's the church? And you find the first time that there's sort of an excommunication is when you have, Cain kills Abel, and Cain is not able to be executed, and instead he's cast out, right? And so that's kind of the first time you have the separated worship with the world and the church.
mm,
And then you have in the Noahic covenant the establishment of the sword. So these kind of four places where individual, household, church, and state are created are sort of the grants of authority. These are the constitutions from the law of God for these different authorities, and what their jurisdiction is, what extent of operation they have, and where their boundaries hit. So the individual can't just rule over other individuals. The household grants authority over the wife and over children and over servants. The church, there's an order that has to do with sanctions in terms of blessing, curses, the keys, letting in, kicking out, but not the sword. And then you have the state with the sword, right? So these things, that's the biblical order established by divine law. But when we come to this, if you don't start with the Bible, then you're going to be humanistic. You're going to be like, well, you and I, we're basically gods, right? So why can one God tell another God what to do? Or I'm going to say, you and I are basically bacteria that have colonized. And so, why should I care? My colony of bacteria will dominate your colony of bacteria. So that sort of becomes the framework. And so I don't know why you would care about contracts at all, right? When you go to like, Rousseau or Hobbes or Locke or any of the efforts to try to deal with the idea of this, that you end up having to go to God, and Locke, to some extent was more orthodox than the other ones, although there's
mhm,
stuff about his later life where, Unitarianism or whatever, various claims about that. So social contract is this effort to say, you and I as individuals, we can come to an agreement, and we could establish a mutual authority where I could say, you get to do this and I'll submit to you as long as you provide this service or whatever. So it becomes an exchange of, I'm going
mhm,
to give you property and obedience and loyalty, and there's certain things that you can demand of me, but you're going to provide these services for me. So it becomes sort of this exchange of services there. And so kings just become sort of merely contracted services. And
mm,
so, you can find like, Murray Rothbard's efforts to essentially make insurance companies into governments is sort of the maximalization of that. Um, but this idea, there are six basic ways that people have attempted to justify a
mhm,
political theory.
mhm,
And those six ways are, again, divine law, which I think is the correct answer. Next one is anarchy, that there's no basis for any man to control another man, to coerce another man to whatever. The social contract, which is an effort to sort of take the divine law system of covenant and make it humanistic, trying
yep,
to get all the benefits, the fruit of Christian order, while trying to avoid the responsibility to obey God's law, so we can define the contract the kind of the way we want. Sometimes that's blended with natural law, which is sort of an effort to say, yeah, we want Christian order, maybe we want the God of the Bible, sort of, but I want to be able to argue that in a sphere where people don't accept the Bible. And so it becomes sort of this like embarrassment towards the Bible where people are ashamed of the Bible as the source for their political theory. They start to move towards this natural law view. And you either end up just smuggling in the biblical things and try to find a way to say that like parakeets prove it, or you end up with this sort of made up version of the law based upon what you saw in chimpanzees. And so this effort to look around at the world and find something in nature. And the response of anybody listening who's a natural law guy will go, no, that's not it. You have to look at the nature of man. He's a political animal, and you've got to derive it from those things. It's just like, okay, so you're what your observations are about yourself and about other people. You're saying that becomes a normative thing. You're deriving oughts from ises,
Mm,
and you're doing all these other things where you're taking particular observations and universalizing them. Right? There's all these logical errors. Just any sort of cursory effort to apply the principles of careful logical reasoning to natural law makes it a total mess. And the response when you're talking to guys who want to defend natural law, if they're kind of orthodox Calvinistic and Christian, they're going to go like, "Well, I'm really just meaning the biblical moral law." It's like, cool. Why don't we just say that? And so
yeah.
this the next thing is this effort to say divine right, which is what John Locke was largely arguing against, which is this claim
Hmm.
that well, Adam was an absolute monarch of everything, and his heirs received all of that, and we can trace the King of England back to Adam, and he has fief simple, that he has over England, and that's sort of the basis. And so I think there was some bishop named Fuller that he was arguing against in his first treatise on
Yeah.
American government or on civil government. And so the divine right, the idea of inheriting some sort of absolute rule, is not is a bastardization of divine law, right? It's sort of this like taking divine law and saying God gave me the authority to rule. The law of God says that I can rule, so what I say is now law of the land. And it's sort of an appeal to God, but then still absolutized into a human being. And that absolutization into a human being is still sort of a making man God, and making other men to be sort of beasts under him. And so then the last effort is to say social contract, natural law, divine right. These are all sort of a joke. Social contract. That nobody's ever actually formed this contract. No government can ever find its origin to this. Natural law is logically ridiculous. The divine right claim is an absurd thing going back to either I want to challenge a combat or I can show myself back to Adam or whatever the thing is. There's no justification for that. In reality, we have men govern men because it's convenient. This is the reality that the way things work is it's necessary that the strong rule the weak and that they organize things this way. And so he who he who can rule should rule. And power comes from the end of a gun or a spear or whatever. Right. So all of these turn into sort of just like horrible moral cynicism, except for divine law. If we say, actually, civil government's appointed by God, the mechanisms for choosing rulers are appointed by God, we ought to see the state ruled according to the law of God. And there are sufficient principles in this divine law code to make it so that we know how we ought to see civil power organized, put into place, and how it should function in different circumstances. That's the only one that provides a cure for moral cynicism, for anarchy, for realpolitik. And so I would suggest that it is better than social contract theory.
Yes, I would agree, and I think that's a very helpful summary of those different ways in which people have tried to um, justify wielding swords and making people do things that they don't necessarily want to do. Um, and so that leads me to then, as we look at the founding of the United States, which is, I mean, when you look at the founding documents, it's clearly covenantal in language. I mean, just real quick, the opening statement of the Constitution, you see the founders are even saying that in the last half that they're trying to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, and do ordain and establish this Constitution. So even though they may not specifically mention God in that statement, they are thinking about not just their own generation, and they're doing this for future generations. And then even earlier back, living in Pennsylvania, I'm a big fan of William Penn, and in his Pennsylvania Charter of Privileges, he even says that William Penn, uh, governor of the province of Pennsylvania, belonging for myself, my heirs, have declared and confirmed. that neither I nor my heirs shall do anything that violates the liberties in this charter, nor any part shall be infringed or broken. And if anything is done that tries to break it, it shall be held of no force. So, like, that's pretty strong language that William Penn is basically saying, whatever anybody after me does, it's null and void if it goes against this covenant, this document. And that's from 1701. So, um, and so when I did my research on what was going on in England, and I saw the formation of the Solemn League and Covenant, and that contributed a bit to the English Civil War. I was wondering your thoughts on how those events, particularly the Solemn League and Covenant, impacted in any way the American founding or the mindset of the founding fathers. Do you see a connection there?
Yeah, I absolutely do. I think that what you find in the founding fathers is sort of a syncretism between Calvinist political theory and sort of a more humanistic Enlightenment branch. And so you'll find terms that are used equivocally,
Hmm.
right? So some men, I talked about natural law, meant the moral law of God that was implanted in the heart of Adam and would have been identical with the law communicated in the two great commandments, the Ten Commandments, and explained out in the general equity of the moral of the civil law and stuff like that. And so they would have viewed the common law of England and as an expression of the Puritan effort to manifest the general equity or the common law of nations coming out from the civil law of Israel, and so the common law was incorporated into the Constitution, right? So that in reality, the Constitution starts with the idea of blessings, and they would have all understood blessings to have been coming from the God of the Bible, and
Hmm.
then they would also you have this common law, which is the effort to apply the general equity, right? So you have all of this background. And then there would have also been an understanding of the rights of Magna Carta being a significant thing. King Alfred, his establishment, where he basically does a copy and paste, in Microsoft Word of Deuteronomy, into the law code, which also happened in Massachusetts in its charter and its laws. And you would have found that sort of the English Bill of Rights in 1689 would have had a significant influence. So those are things there. And so you go, okay, well, these are all things that are background. So how does the Solemn League and Covenant relate? Well, the idea of covenantal view of sort of the Scottish Covenanters and the Protestant Reformation's view of the civil order would have had a significant impact. You have a document called the Magdeburg Confession, which is an effort to deal with the right of lesser magistrates to resist higher magistrates. You would have had uh, Vindicia contra tyrannos, that would have been read, a Huguenot book against tyrants. John Knox's various political writings. These things would all have been thought about significantly, and Calvin's view of covenants and of the relationship of these orders. This is all stuff that would have been kind of in the air. They would have all just be breathing, especially you read like Sam Adams. He's referring to a lot of this in his kind of Congregationalist Puritan world, and you'll find Puritan ministers writing a good deal about this. And so that's all there. And the problem is, again, sort of the syncretism. We can talk more about that later. But
Hmm.
but basically, the Solemn League and Covenant was agreed upon in 1643. You have the Scottish adopting it in August, and you have the English adopting it in September. Right, so this is sort of this mutual covenanting. And the thing is, Solemn League and Covenant was an effort to basically covenant to see, um, you know, righteous civil order established, including the establishment of the true religion in the land, with what's called a covenanted uniformity. The covenanted uniformity is a swearing to uphold together uniform externals in the church, and that has to do with doctrine, worship, and government. So the Westminster Standards came out of that. So, like the Westminster Confession was an effort to have a form of doctrine, to have words in the English language that explain a system of doctrine. There was a form of worship, and that would have been the Westminster Directory of Public Worship, as well as Directory of Family Worship. And then you find the idea of a form of government, which what was written by the Westminster Assembly was the Presbyterial form of government. And so that those documents were the effort to have a covenanted uniformity. And the church has always sort of had this goal of we want to have unity, and the mechanisms by which we can grow in unity are manifested, for example, in Acts 15. where the saints assembled together. There was the apostles, the elders, and the messengers. The apostles, the elders, and brethren. And so we don't have apostles continuing, but the idea of people gathering together and having a council to be able to discuss things and capture points of conclusion that, if they are biblical, are to be propagated and supported. And it's sort of a systematization, right? Which is what confessional documents or rules of practice are about. And they're only authoritative if they're what Scripture teaches. And that idea that it's the same way that the instruction of a parent, when it accords with God's teaching, has the authority of God's word, but then also there's like a duty to honor parents that kind of adds a responsibility. Sort of like that's what a sermon does too, right? So anyway, so that effort to do that. When you look at Acts 15, there was a capturing of, here are four principles. We looked at Moses' law is not to be kept anymore, referring specifically to the ceremonies. And then, but here are four ceremonies to be kept, and it refers to Leviticus 17 and 18, where you have sort of, okay, don't don't have things that are polluted by idols, don't have don't have blood, don't have animals that are killed in such ways to keep the blood in them, and then also here's to keep these sexual laws. And so you have this that exists in Leviticus 17 and 18, where you have this listing out of all these laws, including the laws of who you can marry in closeness of blood or marriage. Those are some of those sexual laws that are listed out there. And so people read that and they're kind of like, most of the time people say, hey, this is supposed to be a bunch of stuff here that's like things that the Jews were offended by or whatever. And but why does it say that it's necessary that we do these things? Why is it the Holy Spirit commanding these things? Why is it that the apostles are putting their hand to support this? Why is the church imposing this on people everywhere as sort of a rule, when it's not? You're now saying I'm obligated to keep these things. So this like effort to go and systematize is an important thing, and that is the covenanted uniformity, is what the church has attained to in terms of doctrine, worship, and government. And so that happens first at Jerusalem in the New Covenant era. And so you find some major steps like that with like Nicaea, this effort to talk about you know the doctrine of the Trinity, and then you have Chalcedon with the doctrine of the Incarnation. So you find sort of steps where the church works through stuff, and does this well. So Westminster was an effort to do that.
Mhm.
There had been efforts in the Reformation, including, like, for example, the Synod of Dort, where the canons of Dort were put forward, where you get tulip. And that was a multinational and international council of Reformed churches gathering to capture that. And when you get to Westminster, what happens is you have Ireland, Wales, England, and Scotland being called together to have a international assembly to be able to pull together covenanted uniformity across those nations. And the background of why that was called was in 1638, the King of England and Scotland, Charles I, tried to impose a book of common prayer on Scotland
Mhm.
that would make way for ceremonies that were of human invention, and that would make way for sort of arbitrary government at the hand of the king over the church, to undermine Presbyterianism and to undermine the careful regulated principle of worship and sola scriptura for doctrine, and the divine right of government in the church. So, referred to as jus divinum. And this idea that God has imposed a system of doctrine in His Word. He's given us a doctrine of worship, and we should apply it. And he's given us a doctrine for church government, and we should apply it. And so there was this concern in Scotland to preserve all of that. And the imposition of the Book of Prayer was something that literally brought in just a few ceremonies, like kneeling at taking the Lord's Supper as opposed to sitting at a table, kneeling, having an altar placement as opposed to a table placement, where it's supposed to be the table in the middle, an altar against the wall. The idea of sort of the sign of the cross being given in baptism, the use of a wedding ring as necessary to the formation of a wedding, because of the idea that you need a sign of the covenant that's visible to everybody. The idea of liturgical calendar and vestments for officers of the church. These were the main things in that were imposed, and the Scottish were like, "Nope, we're going to fight a war of this." But that was their response, was to these ceremonies. They were like, "Nope, we're going to fight a war." So first of all, God bless them, right? Just like so amazing, like the guts to just be like, no, rather than kneeling at the Lord's Supper, we're going to fight a war. And so So that kind of guts to do that is sort of the thing that led to what was called the Bishops' Wars,
Hmm.
first and second. King Charles brings an army into Scotland. The Scots defeat it because they refuse to comply, and they keep their reformed religion. And then they defeat the army. And then there's a second one where there's a raising of another army, and so the Scots go on the offensive to try to stop it because after the defeating of the first offensive army, when they recognized that they were going to be attacked repeatedly, they determined that it was their duty to go on an offensive war to try to stop it, to get the king to stop trying to harass them. And
Hmm.
so this background leads into the Solemn League and Covenant, where the Parliament is resisting the arbitrary authority of the king. The Puritans, in particular, want to see the church reformed, and so they form a covenant with the Scots to see the reformed religion established and to defeat the king in order to see this done. And
Hmm.
so that is sort of the background for that. And I think that there's two major things that happened. Um, First, when 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 the Puritans won, Cromwell overthrew the Presbyterian government,
Hmm.
and what he did is he ended up breaking the Solemn League and Covenant and said, "No, I don't want to impose Presbyterian system." He did lots of stuff that was similar. His Puritan views, at least, were very similar, but that led to a war with the Scots, and I think the Scots foolishly allied themselves with Charles II.
Yeah.
I think that was a foolish decision. But the next thing is this when Cromwell dies, his son Richard is not really fit to rule,
Yeah.
and there was a continuation of a hereditary, sort of monarchy essentially. And Richard does not manage to rally support to himself, does not manage to govern in a way that prevents a loss of confidence, and so a General Monk, who is a Presbyterian, reinstates Charles II. He uses the army to do that. That leads to what's called the Killing Times.
Hmm.
And the killing times involve there's an expulsion of Puritan ministers, about 3,000 across Scotland and England. There were 6 million people at the time. There were 3,000 ministers that were so awesome that they were unwilling to keep the Book of Common Prayer. They were so concerned for the regulated principle of worship that they refused to keep their office and lose their livelihoods and to become political enemies of the king rather than compromise on that worship. And so, that's basically the population of Arizona is about 6 million right now. And so I don't think there are 6 million ministers that would lose their jobs over that kind of list of stuff in the Book of Common Prayer. So I think that
Yeah.
that amazingness there, but it led to there was this effort to occupy and Scotland and kill Covenanters, the guys that took this covenant to uphold the
Wow.
Solemn League and Covenant. And in England, there was a persecution of the Presbyterians, especially, and so the Presbyterians were viewed as those that would be most effectual in uniting to resist the king and to potentially have another resistance. There's one Congregationalist, John Owen. One of the glorious things about him is in his old age, he was arrested because after Charles II was restored, he was arrested because his house was searched and they found it full of crates of pistols. Um, and he was in the middle of helping to organize another resistance against this time against Charles II. And so I love that story about John Owen. But anyways, so all that say this is the kind of the background. And when you have Charles II dies, the heir to the throne is his brother James II, who's a papist. And
Mhm.
and having him come into office, everyone kind of went, look, this was bad with Charles II, and what we did to the Puritans was actually really bad. And there were like plagues and stuff and fires in London, and everybody was like, this is probably the judgment of God for what we're doing to the Puritans. We should really not have done this. Well, this is going to be bad. And then when the papist guy is going to come into office, they're like, all right, this is enough.
We're
So
done.
so there's this uprising all of a sudden, and the chief magistrate in the Netherlands is like the third in line to the throne, and his wife is like the second in line. So it's William and Mary, and so they come over, and the Archbishop of Canterbury at this time is an Arminian, right? And he's been in conversation with William, and William's kind of like argues with him about Calvinism, and he's like, okay, well, whatever, I'm going to head over there, and so he heads over there, and everything kind of works together. William kind of hops off a ship onto the English coast, and his armies are unloading, and he meets this like Arminian archbishop and says to him, "Do you believe in predestination now?" And so like that's like the best entrance ever, right? I mean, like you're just like, how did this happen in real life? Like this is so so that's what William does. And he comes in, and one of the good things he does is he stops the persecution of the Puritans and
Mhm.
establishes the 1689 Bill of Rights. The bad thing is he rejects the covenant and doesn't go back to restore it. And so what you end up with is still sort of this group of this kind of this split in Scotland in the church between the covenanters that survived and said, no, we have to support the established church having the covenant that we all took. And you got the other guys that are like, well, this is better than what we had, and so we're gonna, support this established church in Scotland there. So all this stuff, all the death and everything about the established church is a part of the thing where there's a concern about the centralized establishment of religion,
Mhm.
and that concern about it. I'm establishmentarian. I believe in having that, but the concern at the time was, look, the Reformation was a great thing, but the lessons we've learned from history, not from the Bible, but from history, are that attempting to establish this sort of centralized church leads to all of these other problems. And so, in order to stop the bloodletting, we need to avoid having a fight over a centralized established church. And so, the First Amendment is a major part of that.
Mhm.
And there's sort of different views on the First Amendment, which is that it simply stops a decentralized establishment or that it prevents any establishment at all, even at the state level. Now,
Mm.
obviously, the way it was read initially was that it prevented centralized establishment at the federal level
Congress.
and that it allowed for individual states to have an established religion. But there were some, even at that time, who were advocates of disestablishmentarianism.
Hmm.
So, for example, Thomas Jefferson and his friend, all of a sudden it's leaving my head. I can't remember if
Um,
it's
was it Madison?
yeah. Thank you. So, wrote together the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions,
Yeah.
and they encouraged the disestablishment in Virginia on the grounds of the evil of establishment as a whole. Right, that was
Mm.
sort of the general argument was against the principle of establishmentarianism. So, I think that this history was a really big deal in their minds of the Reformation because they're thinking about not only is there the fight between Protestant and Catholic, but there was in England very specifically the fight between the monarchical, Protestant Episcopal establishment versus sort of the Covenanter and the Congregationalists, and the Congregationalists and the Covenanters having had some alliance for a time, and then sort of the Congregationalists take over in England. So all that to say, that's a huge background, and when
Mm.
you get to here, the English law order is a huge deal. The covenantal view of the state is a huge deal. And the question of the establishment of the church is a major part of the concern, where you have these guys that said, historically, this led to a lot of bloodletting in England. And maybe we can save ourselves from all of it by just moving religion out of the concern of the centralized establishment. The
Mm.
result is that, we're, ruled by atheists, Muslims, and whatever else, right? And so we have this sort of we've gone down the line a couple hundred years, and we're receiving the fruits of sort of a total disestablishmentarian view where you remove all Christian establishment. So I think
Hmm.
that's a big part of the background and sort of the view there. These guys all read all these, these various Protestant writers, Lex Rex from Rutherford, Aaron's Rod Blossoming from Gillespie. They're all engaging with this literature and they're citing it a lot.
Mm.
And so, Vidicii contra Tyrannus gets cited a lot. Those are various books that get cited. So these guys are thinking about this, and they're also citing Locke, and they're citing Hume, and so they're engaging with sort of the mixture, and that syncretism is the real influence. And I think the lesson to be learned there is that we need to be more careful to apply the Bible strictly and to avoid the influence of recent experience, recency bias, and to avoid the influence of the syncretism with human philosophy.
Yeah, it seems like you mentioned the syncretism. It seems like it's a two-part thing where not only is it folks trying to distance themselves from God, His Word, and His law in the civic sphere, but also the adoption of this social contract, individualizing concept, and those two together, it seems like that's what we have today in the United States is the result of that. It's a very individualistic. It's more of the you scratch my back, I scratch yours. Where's the government? I pay this money. They need to take care of me, take care of my problems, education, roads. food, well, now in New York City, grocery stores, we want the government to provide grocery stores and housing. That seems like that's a social contract thing. And then, of course, divorcing that from any reference to God, the God of the Bible, I should say. And so now it seems like we've come to have lost and forgotten this concept of a biblical civil covenanting, and that's the effect it's having on us today. Like, would you agree with that? Would you add more to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right, and I think that 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 idea of thinking about the state in terms of a social contract, turning it into the exchange of kind of goods and services, um, does make it so that there's an unlimited power ultimately with the state, right? So you end up with state grocery stores, and it doesn't typically work out very well either. You know, they don't have as good of a variety, or even have food on the shelves as often as what you find with the kind of the free market grocery stores. And
Yeah.
so I think that this, the Declaration of Independence, the way it's written, very clearly is a covenant lawsuit against the king. It ignores
Hmm.
the parliament, right? And it's like it's because of that legislature argument you made earlier on, where you were saying, hey, they had their own legislatures, and then they had a shared chief executive, right? And so that recognition of different domains of the chief executive was very common in sort of the feudal world, where you'd have like very distinct jurisdictions with that sort of a setup of different legislatures. So that would have been very well understood in the past. This fight that we just went through in terms of the history, where the 1689 Bill of Rights comes in, you have William and Mary coming into play. The Parliament gains a lot of power. And then you
Hmm.
have sort of some weak monarchs over time, and so the Parliament tries to like take all of the powers of the king, which sort
Hmm.
of blends the executive and the legislative powers and
Yep.
destroys a lot of this sort of uh, common covenantal setup of a shared executive. And so that overreach by Parliament really does lead to them exercising powers over the colonies that they don't have, and stealing the legislative power of the colonies. And so there's sort of historical things that occur, and then there's the kind of there's that background, Locke. His first treatise is an argument from Scripture against absolute monarchy, and his second treatise is an argument from natural law in support of some sort of civil order that's a social contract. And these weird blending is really the thing, and the traditions of men always end up pushing out the Scriptures. Right?
Yeah.
There's no room there for both.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And it would seem like one benefit of a biblical form of civil covenanting is that, well, I mean, if we're Christians, we recognize the depravity of man and the desire to restrain man's evil. We saw with the Solemn League and Covenant, they're trying to uh, restrain what the king is doing unlawfully with regards to forcing a particular, Book of Common Prayer and, some papist worship practices or things that really looked very close to that. And then, of course, so you covenant to resist and respond to that. And it seems like there was something very similar happening with the American colonies covenanting together to resist what they believed was a violation of the rights of Englishmen, the violation of the covenant that had been formed with the king and the colonies there. And so I think that might be, I mean, that's one of the key benefits of a biblical concept of covenanting. And, having lost that, it seems like in our society, um, that I think makes it very, very difficult to resist encroachments of tyranny and things like that. Thoughts on that? Anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think that the syncretism makes it so that there's not a consistent thing to argue, and in fact, it makes a biblical worldview sort of get mocked, right? And so what happens is
Hmm.
efforts to syncretize make you go, "Well, I'm gonna argue from the things that don't get mocked as much." Um, and so in America, we have, this sort of mixture of social contract, natural law, and realpolitik, right? This the pragmatism.
Hmm.
And sort of there's this secular respectability, and sort of this our culture shifted so much that's kind of where it goes. Whereas in the past, it was like natural law, what works, plus the Bible, or whatever. So this whole thing sort of um, morphs towards this tendency to go to what is acceptable in the culture. And I think when we look at our own kind of cultural history or covenantal history, what we find is that this loss of the sense of covenant makes it so that we look at everything in terms of a contract. Everything becomes kind of morphable and renegotiable. You're always trying to renegotiate the contract, so there's no
Yep.
authority. It's merely a contract to be negotiated.
Yep.
And so rather than saying, "Hey, our country had two major errors uh, at the giving of our Constitution," which I'll go into in a second,
Mhm.
and saying, "Well, before that, we had a covenant." You mentioned, the colonies covenanting together. The Articles of Confederation were a national covenant, and they
Mhm.
were explicitly Christian, and even more clearly so than the Declaration of Independence is pretty explicitly Christian.
Mm.
And the Constitution itself, I don't take the view of some covenant. I'm a covenanter, but I don't take the view of some covenanters that the Constitution is atheistic. It certainly is less Christian than it ought to be.
Yeah.
The Constitution, the common law, the reference to blessings, the dating. People argue about the dating not having originally had the Anno Domini or whatever, but the dating, all this stuff that the reference to the Lord's Day in terms of Sunday being a day that's excluded from the
Yep.
veto chain. Like, you got all this stuff in here that it makes it so there's references to rights, that there's some origin of these rights, that is it's all sort of there in the context of a Protestant nation. And so even though it's weaker than it ought to be, it should be made
Mhm.
more explicit. The Articles of Confederation were a pre-existing covenant that was more explicitly Christian, and and so I think you have that there, with that model. And when we see is then with the Constitution coming in and taking its place, chattel slavery is a great sin, and
Mhm.
um, and then furthermore, the First Amendment with the refusal to see a central establishment made it so that there was sort of an agreement to not deal with first table of the law crimes on
Mm.
a federal level, and you end up allowing for the sin of the formation of non-Christian courts, non-Christian governors, because of the absence of having a religious test, right? So these are things that are kind of founding sins in our Constitution. Um,
Interesting.
and so, uh, what we then find is sort of this, like, it further degrades as the systems of representation are eliminated, and we move towards a more direct democracy type of model.
Yeah.
And so the syncretism towards humanism also is an acid that destroys the structures of externalized Christianity. And so some of the neat things about the Constitution is the ways that it preserved a Christian civil order. Um, and so the destruction of that across time is something that I think was part of this syncretism and compromise. And so I think there was a building on of errors.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes sense. And so, from your and I's perspective, this is where we live. This is the era that we live in, and ideally, we can look back and we can hopefully we can learn from the mistakes that were made. And so the question is, all right, well, we have a long way to go in regaining or rekindling, or quite frankly, just becoming more biblical in how we order ourselves as a society, as a nation. Um, and I think so. Some my listeners might say, "Yeah, that all sounds great, but what do we do now? Like, where do we go from here? What are the next steps when it comes to this?" And how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I would say we need to understand where we're at, right? And so if we understand that basically the structures have been destroyed, and I think two of those major ones is we have, like, the state, for example, no longer is protected in terms of its right as a mediating institution between us and the federal government. The Senate
Mm.
used to be sort of the mechanism by which that was defended, and you have the 17th Amendment in 1913 destroying the ability of states to have their own representatives.
Yeah.
And then you have also the household being destroyed, the doctrine, the common law doctrine of coverture being destroyed through the 19th Amendment, allowing women to vote directly. Um, and so you go, okay, so the household is not protected. The man's ability to void, contracts and oaths of his wife, that's given in Numbers 30, has been taken away by the elimination of coverture. The household representation has been taken away by the 19th Amendment. States having representation is taken away by the 17th Amendment,
Mhm.
and all taxation can go directly now to people and not go through the states. And so all the mediating institutions have been destroyed. We live in a grand democracy now, right?
Mm.
That's sort of to some extent we have some of the protections of republic, but in reality, structurally, we have tons of functions of democracy. And even churches don't understand the idea of really family representation well with the household vote or anything. A lot of these things have been eliminated in churches. And there's this kind of appealing directly to the individual without the mediating institution of the household. So all of that exists. So you go, wow, feminism, egalitarianism, the destruction of the household are really huge deals. So what do I need to do? It's like, well, first you need to run a household really well. So this whole like, it's like, oh, how do we go fix everything with the grand reins of power? It's like, stop it. Like, just which is like, I look, we're all addicted to state power, and I want you to listen to me very carefully here, and here's a careful and slow method by which you might be able to overcome this tendency. Stop it. Right? Like, that's so that right there, like, it's just like back up for a minute and recognize that where you have the most power is over yourself and over your family. If you are a lesser magistrate or if you're a church officer, there's more to do, right? But,
Mhm.
like, it's like, okay, you need to be productive, get resources, and free yourself as much as possible from the tyrannical systems and the system of the world as you can. And you need to create with your own leadership as the head of a house the covering under which your wife can come under your wing, your children come under your wing. Maybe you can be an employer and start to build Christian businesses. You get resources, you can start to have influence in that way, be a man of valor, right? These are big deals, right? So that's a big part of it. And so it's recognizing that we have to create from the rubble new institutions.
Hmm.
And so as you have resources, like everybody wants to talk, but I'll tell you what, if you haven't done anything, if you don't have any resources, if you haven't built the institutions, if you don't have other people already cooperating with you, nobody cares is sort of the thing. So it's like, okay, so it's like if you're doing something, if you're consistently doing something, like let's say you consistently have a podcast where you're talking to people day in and day out. It's just sort of like this like gradual thing. That drip of activity is the beating of a drum beat, and stability of action and consistency of action as opposed to just occasional rising up.
Hmm.
That makes it so that you're helping to start to rally people and to get them to think. If you're building something locally, that's something that makes it so that you start to rally people and get stuff done. And so this sort of consistency of action to gradually build here a little, there a little, precept upon precept, line upon line, brick upon brick is the work that needs to be done. And there's this despising of the days of small beginnings that occurs. People go like, no, but let's just reach for the reins of power and try to make it all happen now. It's like, nope, it doesn't work. You don't have the power. You don't have the influence.
Hmm.
You have to gradually build that. So
Yeah.
that reality, and then protecting your family from bad churches and from bad civil government. You limit yourself from the the dangers of by not being as visible. You don't put yourself in constant contact with tyrannical, low level magistrates who want to feel powerful.
Mhm.
Um, and what you also do is you make sure if there's not a good church, you either start one or you move to a place where there is one.
Hmm.
And so this idea of needing a good church that is strongly biblical, that will have a covenanted uniformity of doctrine, worship, and government, will seek to coordinate with and associate with other churches of like faith and practice. And this idea of try to rally people there, coordinate together, to cooperate together, opportunities for that, that creates the context in which you can start to form a civil covenant. And a
Yeah.
civil covenant is functionally Christians swearing together to work together for certain civil ends
Hmm.
and to defend each other against tyrannical action. And
Yeah.
so that coordination for political purposes is something that people need to be thinking about. And as little pockets get formed, the process across time is that those little pockets start to find each other. And then they
Yeah.
turn into bigger combined pockets. And then they start to find other bigger combined pockets. And as tyranny increases, it motivates other people to come and rally there. So the beginning parts are hard. The initial structure formations are hard. The finding of other people is hard. And then it starts to accelerate. And that's true of almost anything that grows is the beginning is small and hard. And then once it starts to bear fruit, it becomes a lot better more quickly. And so we have to see the tree grow to the point of maturity where it bears fruit.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't think that despairing is not the answer, of course. I mean, just looking back at history, Alfred the Great did his work. That was around 900 AD, and he didn't get the Magna Carta until a bit later. And then it took a little bit more time before you have the Reformation, the Puritans, you have the uh, English civil rights, 1689. Um, and it does, I mean, certainly even before the Reformation, things are very, in many ways, unbiblical as far as what the Catholic Church was doing and its role with the civil government. Um, and I'm sure for many of them it looked daunting. But as the Reformation spread and you saw the covenants being formed, like the Magdeburg Confession or Covenant, um, you did see really the rise of liberty, a true biblical concept of liberty. And so I agree with you that we should not despair, and that if we just you know take the small steps in faith, obeying the Lord in all that we do, and of course, thinking long term, thinking beyond our own generation to the second, third, fourth, fifth generations. Um, I think there is certainly hope there. It's ultimately in Christ. Thank you for pointing that out and tell us to stop being stop being statists in a way, right?
Yeah, no, I agree with that, and I think that one thing is just one of the hopes is that this is the way God has designed reality, right? So if we seek to apply God's law as individuals, households, churches, and seek to form civil orders that have these things, that we will find that there's blessing that makes it so that power flows to us. That will be the general tendency.
Yeah, and I think that what's really important, maybe people don't think about this, is that uh, if we all agree that apart from Christ, we're only going to get further and further down the trail of sin, slavery, and political tyranny. And what we don't want to have happen is because we see that without restraint, the state and tyranny will increase. What you don't want to have happen is a French Revolution. So
Yep.
at some point, when things get bad enough, you're gonna get that 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 flash in the pan act of violence, and it's gonna be an ungodly, unbiblical act of rebellion. So as Christians, we want to avoid that, but the only way to avoid that is to do exactly what you just laid out: is form those small pockets to bring stability and self-restraint and control, so that it's a biblical kind of resistance, not a not an evil demonic form of revolution, right? So that's kind of something that we should also think about.
Yes. Yeah, I think praying that we be spared from that is a big deal. I think that, the types of revolution, right, there's this we want to avoid anarchy, we want to avoid, sort of mob rule and gang rule and all that kind of stuff, and criminals become the excuse of tyrants, and tyrants become the excuse of criminals. And so there
Interesting.
is this sort of pendulum swinging, of each other, using each other as excuses. And
Hmm.
you see that, and even political parties begin to do things. So, like, you find sort of, um, this, funny thing with, the Democrats always trying to talk about the concern about right-wing violence, and then left-wing violence is all you see, and then there's always sort of this, like, the defending of criminality and refusing to punish, crimes, and they call it, petty crimes or crimes of poverty types of stuff, and it's just man, this is a base attempt to appeal to popularity to get the votes of criminals. Um,
Hmm.
and then on the Republican side, the law and order thing, well, it's not an ordered liberty under law that's being advocated in some cases. It's more of a, we need to use executive power and privilege to just jam through whatever, right?
Hmm.
And so you have just the praising of the rise of the setup for tyranny,
Yeah.
those things occurring. And so you go, well, sometimes to fix a situation, you have to use extraordinary power in an emergency. And I would say that that's sort of true. Like, you have to deal with, like, mob, violence or whatever, using some sort of, kind of extraordinary powers in a short way, and you restore order and all that kind of stuff. But if you don't have the goal explicitly in mind of establishing the law of God being laid out as the way that's done, you're merely setting up an arbitrary power.
Hmm.
There are time to to form up a citizens militia and to civilly covenant and to resist a tyrant, and that's an extraordinary act, right? You don't normally organize a people's militia to go and fight the existing civil power. That's an extraordinary act, and so sorts of extraordinary acts, things that are out that are irregular and that are the remedies for extreme problems,
Hmm.
are the types of things that are meant to be as short as possible, and then are also supposed to be used to restore the proper order quickly. And you can find that whether it's for religious purposes or for the civil authority, or for a household. For example, a wife separating from a husband is an extraordinary act, and she needs to quickly appeal to the church government and to the civil government if there's like, oh, my husband is beating me or doing something that makes it so that I have to flee. So okay, well, you need to call upon some sort of public authority to restore things quickly, or to go through an orderly proceeding for a lawful divorce. And so
Hmm.
those kinds of actions, the extraordinary action, whether it's at a lower level or whether it's at a higher level, is always something that has to be quickly restored to law, or else you are just setting up an arbitrary government. And with you find that with the church as well, where you go, okay, well, if we need to organize a local church, we need to quickly move to having a government where we have officers. Or if there's Hezekiah's reform in Second Chronicles 29 and 30, there's this thing like ordinarily the priests are the ones who administer the Passover and deal with the sacrifices. There was a short period of time where the Levites were doing that work, and it was ordinarily forbidden them. But it's approved of God in this Reformation where there's a shortage of priests. There's a devolution of authority to these Levites. And so you have this like the evolution of authority and the devolution of authority are things that occur to maintain order. The goal is to stay as close to the ordinary and settled order as possible according to God's law, using this evolution or devolution in a temporary way to remedy some abuse because of a sinner in the office. And then your goal is to seek to restore an ordinary order. And I think that instead, there's sort of this like yearning that's existing, and I'm seeing more and more of, for the use of extraordinary power to try to set everything aright with some sort of like right wing utopian proletariat vision. And it's like that doesn't quite work. And we need to be going towards a very settled biblical order as quickly as possible. And having those steps laid out and studying the law of God to think about what's the settled order and what are the steps that might occur to help us to move towards that settled and mature order as quickly as possible is the study that I think needs to occur. And I think discussions where men are covenanting together, seeking to do this work, studying the law of God and talking about sort of those intermediary steps and how the lesser magistrates involved and all that kind of stuff. Those are things that needs to be great care around, and not out of frustration, the throwing off of all order in favor of the mere exertion of force to bring about some goal that you have. uh, Means matter. Means are
Hmm.
very important.
I would agree with that. Absolutely. Yeah, how we go about this very much matters. Well, regrettably, our time is running short, Pastor Reese. It's been a great conversation, and I'm sure we could talk for much longer. And I do hope that in the future we'll be able to have you back on again to talk about other topics. Um, but do you have any final thoughts, closing statements before we finish off today?
Thank you. I think the last thing I want to leave people with is the idea that I think that realistically looking at the situation we find ourselves in right now, that balkanization, that is sort of the most likely positive outcome to see any sort of Christian establishment in any zone at all. And that what we need to be looking for is opportunities for peaceable and orderly balkanization, not some sort of utopian hope of seeing the whole of the United States reformed by some sort of use of executive privilege through,
Mhm.
somebody like President Trump, who does not have a credible profession of faith. And so that sort of recognition that we need to be looking for that. There's two great dangers here as we think about the tyranny and anarchy, but there's also this realization that as great empires start to destabilize, that they either go towards extreme centralization in an effort to restore order, or they go towards balkanization.
Mhm.
When you look at the Roman Empire, the West balkanized and the East centralized.
Hmm.
And the Eastern example of centralization makes it so that you're stuck in a death match constantly of trying to make sure that the emperor is your guy. Whereas if you have a balkanization that occurs, what you can find is a bunch of different places where there's rallying around the organization of capital and some power that is able to form up in a way that takes more account of smaller interests. And so what you will find is sort of whether it's a federal or feudal or whatever system of covenanting where people organize and there's a respect for more local rights. That's sort of the thing that I think can occur. And the move, what we need to recognize is a need for a Christian covenanted body with an electorate that's explicitly Christian, that's household representation, a system of graded courts, sort of what you find with Moses and Jethro, that this is the vision that I would encourage people to think about, and the idea that we need to be looking for a process for peaceable exit, and that not
Hmm.
getting tied up in utopian dreams of otherwise is the only way for us to intelligently deal with this. So getting resources, organizing men together, having churches that are organized, that are thinking about these things properly, building up wealth, having your own household be well ordered, raising up your children in the fear and admonition of the Lord. These localized things, with the hope of seeing a peaceable process for exit, for the establishment of Christian authority at a local level, that these are the most practical means that we have available to us. And if we wait too long and the strong man enters office, he will not let us peaceably exit.
Hmm.
So for us, I think the great fear of Christians has to be, how do we find ways of having zones of our own control and to be locked into a death match for the central control is something that will not go well for the church. Marxists are far more deceptive and clever about worldly power than we are. And if we try to be locked into that perpetual power struggle for the central authority, there are so many godless that we will not be well positioned to win. The balkanization principle is the strategy that makes sense in our time. That's what I would want people to think about, and how to encourage and organize towards that, not vacillate between two sides on that, but to be consistently engaged in a policy to advance that.
Hmm. I appreciate that, and I think it's well said. So thank you for that, Pastor Reece. Um, so again, thank you again for coming on to the show, and I hope to speak to you again in the not too distant future.
Thank you for having me on. Lord bless you.
Well, I hope that you enjoyed that interview. I certainly found it informative and quite relevant given our situation today in the United States. Of course, if you have any questions about covenants or civic covenanting, you can email me at thegbgpodcast@gmail.com, or go on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, look for Governed by God or Eric Leupold, and you can contact me there. If you want to learn more about what Pastor Reece is doing with the Reece Fund, I encourage you to go to reecefund.com. That's REECE fund.com, and learn more about the work that he's doing there. And so again, thank you for joining me today, and until next time, take care and God bless.